When I was a kid, there were a few rules that we had to obey. Don't eat with your elbows on the table. Be nice to your sister. Don't play basketball on Sunday. But strangely, baseball was okay. And I like to think because that was the holier sport, and a little bit closer to the heart of God. But it turns out there was another explanation. You see, baseball we could play in the backyard, right? And then people driving by couldn't necessarily see us. But basketball we played in the driveway in the front, and fellow church members might drive by and see us breaking the Sabbath. So we had some rules of that sort. There were also strict rules on where you could find God, or who could teach you about God. God could not be found in a flower, or in a butterfly, or in a thunderstorm. God was found in church, during the sermon. A sermon delivered by a man. Church was where you found God, at least certain churches, the right ones. You see, in those days, in our the churches we were a part of, women just weren't allowed to serve as deacons or as elders, and certainly not as pastors. And I remember a worship service one Sunday after which there was a congregational meeting, and my mom took my brother and sister and I out the sanctuary and said, "Oh, they're going to have a meeting now and talk about stuff and so forth." And I thought, "Well, Mom, aren't you going to stay for the meeting?" She's like, "Well, I might as well not because I can't vote." And they were going to make important decisions about which songs to sing and what hangings to have up front. And women wouldn't know what to say about that, of course. And never mind that my mom had a successful career or spoke 2 languages and had a deep faith of her own. It was understood that God could only be known in certain places or through certain people. In our reading in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul and his companions are on a journey to share the story of Christ with as many as they could. And Paul has just had a vision of a man from Macedonia urging them to come and help them. So Paul and his companions set off for Macedonia. And their first stop to Macedonia is a town called Philippi. And Philippi was not an especially large or impressive town. It was about 2 miles, the city walls, circumference about 167 acres, 5,000 to 10,000 people. Mostly kind of an agricultural town, so not very important politically or perhaps economically, but it was a Roman colony, so it did have some importance that way. And what Paul and his companions would often do on their journeys when they came to a new place was to search out a synagogue. And that way they'd find some people and have some common ground to share the things that they wanted to share. But when they get to Philippi, they find out there's no synagogue. No synagogue. Now, for there to be a synagogue in those days, many rabbis agreed that you needed at least 10 male heads of households who could form what they called a minyan, or an authoritative corps of leaders. And this was the minimum, some said, that was needed for God's presence to be among them. In other words, some held the view that God could only be found in certain places or among certain people. Gives me flashbacks to my childhood, a little bit. Men determining where God could be found. So no synagogue. Maybe it's time to skip past Philippi, right? Maybe this isn't the place that they're supposed to be at. Well, not so fast. We read that Paul and his companions searched for a place of prayer. A place of prayer would have been sort of an informal gathering of people who were sympathetic to the Jewish faith, where they could pray and study Torah and do some things like that. And so we read that they searched for this place of prayer outside the city gates. What do you think of when you hear outside the city gates?
Countryside?
Countryside, okay. Oh, very, very literal there. That's good. Dan's on the ball. Outside the city gates, maybe not in the city. I like that. But also, what might it mean? It might mean that this is sort of an unofficial activity, right? It gives us the idea that those who are doing this are perhaps doing it unofficially, and they're seen as sort of outsiders. This isn't an approved activity, right, by the local rulers. So they went outside the city gates to a river where they expected to find a place of prayer, and they find a group of people gathered there. Women. Outside the city gates, practicing a spirituality that isn't officially recognized by the local rulers. No synagogue, not even any male leaders. How might we expect Paul to respond now? Well, I had a vision, guys, of a man from Macedonia, and I see he isn't here, so I'm just going to keep on going. Well, instead we read that they sat down with them, right, and began to talk with them. What is the idea of sitting down among them? What does that bring up for you? Community? Hospitality? A certain level of equality, right? If we're all sort of sitting in a circle, it sort of conveys this idea that none of us is higher than anyone else. And so Paul and his companions sit and talk with this group of women gathered there. Now, according to the view I grew up with, we wouldn't expect to find God outside of a proper church or religious setting, and certainly not with a group of women. And according to some Jewish views at the time as well, you might have doubts about finding God in such a setting as well. And yet we read that one of the women there, Lydia, was already a worshiper of God. This means that she was a Gentile who felt drawn to worship God through traditional Jewish practice. And so, here's the key. Paul and his companions are on a journey to bring God to Macedonia, and they get there and find out God is already there. God is already there. When Jesus says in our gospel reading that God is sending the Spirit, he doesn't say that it's to men only, or to men in church, or to people in the right religious setting, or people in the right religion, for that matter. Every time we try to limit how or where God can be found, we fail. Because God can be found everywhere, and with and in all people. Paul and his companions find this out, and so as they share with Lydia about Jesus and these others gathered, it's as natural as anything for her to hear their message, embrace it, and long to be baptized. She's already been praying, gathering, worshiping, in tune with the Spirit. And we know that she is a leader in this community, right? She's a woman who has some leadership standing. She's got a business that she does. And we don't want to not recognize this, especially today being May Day, May 1, but we'll have to save a sermon on labor rights for another time. And then she says, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. And I love how our text ends. It says this at the end of verse 15, and she persuaded us. And she persuaded us. Paul and his companions came to bring something to that place, right? And they found out that perhaps that place also had something to give and to offer to them. I wonder how many times are we so eager to share what we have with someone else, right? That we miss what they might have to share with us. I wonder how many times perhaps we don't quite have our eyes open to see the presence of God within the person that we're with. Child, family member, co-worker, that person driving way too slow when it's 45 miles an hour, right in front of us. The story is told of a once famous Buddhist monastery that had fallen into decline. The abbot there was deeply troubled. The monks were sort of lax in their practice. novices were starting to leave, and even their lay supporters were deserting for other centers. And so the abbot traveled far to a sage, and he shared, hey, here's what's happening in my monastery. We're struggling. Can you help us? And the sage looks at the abbot and says, the reason that your monastery is languishing is because the Buddha is among you in disguise, and you have not honored him. And the abbot thought, wow, the selfless one among us? Who could it be? Is it Brother Hua? Well, he's a little bit lazy. Is it Brother Po? Well, he's kind of dull. Well, he is in disguise, so, maybe dull and lazy would kind of fool us. So he gets back to his monastery, he calls the monks to him, and he recounts to them the sage's words, tells them what the sage has said. And they begin to look at each other with suspicion and awe. Man, one of us? Who could it be? But because they didn't know who it was, they began to treat each other with the honor and the respect that would be due to a Buddha. And as they did that, they each began to glow with a radiance from within. And soon they were attracting novices and lay supporters, and in no time at all, that monastery far surpassed its former glory. Paul comes to Macedonia after having a vision of a man. And he leaves his first Macedonian city, helping start a community of faith led by women. And so may you and I have eyes that are open to see and discover the divine in each person. Man, woman, or child, gay, straight, or transgender, black or white, Christian, Hindu, or Muslim. And may we be open to finding God in a flower, in a butterfly, in the rain, outside the city gates, and maybe even in church. Namaste.
Namaste.